On a quiet November night in the Sea of Japan, death arrives not with an explosion, but with a hiss of gas and the soft thud of bodies hitting the deck. It is 2008, and inside the steel hull of a modern submarine, 20 men are about to die without ever knowing they were in danger. This is the terrifying reality of a machine designed to protect a nation turning against its own crew. The Russian nuclear attack submarine K-152 Nerpa is prowling the cold waters of the Pacific, conducting final sea trials before its official commissioning. The vessel is crowded, carrying a mix of naval officers and civilian shipyard workers who are there to monitor the systems. The atmosphere is tense but routine. The ship is performing well, diving deep and maneuvering through the dark water with the grace of a predator. In the forward compartments, off-duty sailors are playing cards or sleeping. In the control room, the captain watches the glowing screens of the automated battle management system. There is no enemy nearby. There is no fire alarm screaming. There is only the hum of the ventilation fans and the vibration of the propeller. Then, without warning, a sensor in the second compartment registers a phantom threat. The ship's automated fire suppression system, known as LOC, triggers instantly. In a conventional fire, this system is a lifesaver. It floods the compartment with a chemical gas, Freon, designed to displace oxygen and starve the flames. But there is no fire on the Nerpa. There is only a glitch, a ghost signal in the wiring, or an accidental button press. The nozzles in the ceiling hiss open, and the heavy, invisible gas pours into the sleeping quarters. For the men inside, the end comes with bewildering speed. Freon is heavier than air. It does not smell like smoke, it smells like nothing. It settles quickly, filling the space from the floor up. The men sitting on their bunks or standing in the passageways suddenly feel lightheaded. They try to take a breath, but the air provides no sustenance. It is like breathing in a vacuum. Confusion sets in immediately. A sailor tries to stand and his legs fold beneath him. Another tries to shout a warning, but his brain is already starving for oxygen and the words dissolve into a slur. The tragedy is compounded by the submarine's design. As the gas releases, the automated damage control system seals the watertight doors. The heavy steel bulkheads slam shut, locking the compartment. The civilians and sailors are trapped in a sealed steel bottle that is rapidly filling with an asphyxiant. They pound on the doors, but the system overrides their manual efforts. On the other side of the bulkhead, their shipmates can hear the thuds, but they cannot open the door without violating safety protocols. They watch through the small viewing ports as men slump against the walls, sliding down into unconsciousness. It takes minutes for the gas to do its work. 20 people, 17 civilians and 3 sailors suffocate in the dark. 21 others are injured, their lungs and brains damaged by the chemical assault. When the captain finally manages to vent the compartment and the rescue teams rush in, they find no charred wreckage. There is no soot, no melted metal. The playing cards are still on the table. The men look like they have simply fallen asleep where they stood. The Nerpa has not been attacked by a torpedo or a depth charge. It has been attacked by its own automation. This incident serves as a grim prologue to the history of the Russian nuclear submarine fleet. It illustrates a persistent, terrifying theme. The danger of these vessels often comes from within. The sailors who volunteer for the submarine service know they are entering a hostile environment, but they assume the threat lies outside the hull, in the pressure of the deep ocean or the weapons of an adversary. The Nerpa proved that the technology itself is a predator. It asks us to confront a disturbing question. Is the submarine protecting its crew, or is it merely containing them until the system fails? To understand how we arrived at this moment, where a computer could sentence 20 men to death by suffocation, we must look back to the dawn of the nuclear age. The nuclear submarine was not just an evolutionary step in naval warfare, it was a completely new species of weapon. Before the atom was harnessed, submarines were essentially surface ships that could dip underwater for brief periods. In World War II, a diesel-electric U-boat spent most of its time on the surface, running its diesel engines to charge its batteries. When it submerged to attack or evade, it was living on borrowed time. Its electric motors drained the batteries quickly. The air inside the boat grew foul. It had to surface eventually, usually within 24 to 48 hours, or the crew would die. This limitation defined naval strategy for half a century. A submarine was a submersible torpedo boat tethered to the surface by the need for air. It could not hide indefinitely, it could not cross an ocean underwater. It was vulnerable to aircraft and radar every time it came up to breathe. But in the late 1940s, a vision began to form in the minds of American naval engineers, led by the brilliant and abrasive Captain Hyman G. Rickover. They envisioned a propulsion system that did not need air. A nuclear reactor generates heat through fission, which boils water to make steam, which turns a turbine. It requires no oxygen, it produces no exhaust. A nuclear-powered ship could theoretically stay underwater forever, limited only by the amount of food it could carry and the psychological endurance of its crew. The launch of the USS Nautilus in 1954 changed the geography of the planet. Suddenly, the ocean was no longer a surface to be crossed, but a volume to be inhabited. The Nautilus could dive in Connecticut and surface in England without ever breaking the water. It could sail under the polar ice cap, turning the Arctic Ocean from a frozen barrier into a strategic highway. For the Soviet Union, looking out at a world dominated by American naval power, this development was an existential crisis. The United States Navy controlled the Atlantic and the Pacific. American aircraft carriers could project power to the very borders of the USSR. Now, American nuclear submarines could lurk off the coast of Murmansk or Vladivostok, invisible and silent, capable of tracking Soviet ships or launching missiles with zero warning. The Soviet response was driven by desperation and ambition. They had to match the American capability, and they had to do it quickly. They poured enormous resources into their own nuclear program, creating a fleet that would eventually outnumber the Americans. But the strategic purpose of these submarines began to shift. In the early days, they were hunters, designed to sink ships. As the Cold War deepened, they became something else entirely. They became the guardians of the apocalypse. The development of the submarine-launched ballistic missile transformed the nuclear submarine into a strategic deterrent. A land-based missile silo is a fixed target. Satellites can see it, enemy missiles can target it, but a submarine moving slowly in the deep ocean is a hole in the intelligence map. It is a mobile missile field that cannot be preemptively destroyed. This concept, known as second strike capability, became the foundation of global stability. It meant that even if a surprise attack wiped out the United States or the Soviet Union, the submarines patrolling the deep would survive. They would rise to launch depth and fire their missiles, ensuring that the aggressor was also destroyed. It was a suicide pact written in steel and uranium. The psychological impact of this shift on the crews was profound. They were no longer just sailors, they were custodians of the end of the world. They lived in a machine that was built to survive a nuclear war, carrying weapons that could incinerate cities. The pressure to keep these machines operational was absolute. A submarine at the pier was useless. A submarine at sea was a guarantee of national survival. This pressure drove the Soviet Navy to push the boundaries of engineering. They wanted boats that were faster, deeper, and more heavily armed than their American counterparts. They experimented with new materials, new reactor designs, and new levels of automation. They accepted risks that Western navies deemed unacceptable. They built submarines with liquid metal reactors that could freeze solid if they stopped. They built hulls out of titanium that were expensive and difficult to weld. The ocean became a laboratory for extreme engineering. But in their race for supremacy, the Soviet designers often neglected the human factor. They viewed the crew as a component of the system, a biological unit that needed to be managed. They designed safety systems like the lock fire suppression on the Nerpa that prioritized saving the ship over the comfort or safety of the sailors. The tragedy of the Nerpa was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a philosophy that placed the mission above the man. The men who died gasping for air in the Sea of Japan were victims of a cold calculation made decades earlier, a decision that the submarine must survive at all costs, even if the cost was the crew itself. As we descend into the history of the Soviet and Russian nuclear fleet, we enter a world of incredible technological achievement and horrifying systemic failure. We will see machines that broke speed records and depth records. We will see reactors that were marvels of physics, but we will also see the human cost of this ambition. We will see fires that burned underwater for days. We will see men trapped in compartments while their leaders debated on the surface. We will see the ocean floor littered with the radioactive husks of vessels that were pushed too far. The nuclear submarine is the most complex machine ever built by humans. It is a spaceship designed to operate in a hostile environment, carrying a nuclear power plant and a nuclear arsenal. When it works, it is a silent guardian. When it fails, it is a steel coffin. The story of the Nerpa is just the final chapter in a long legacy of disaster. To understand how we got there, we must go back to the beginning, to the frantic days when the Soviet Union first tried to put a reactor to sea, and the ocean taught them that speed and silence are not the only things that matter. The launch of the USS Nautilus in 1954 did not just break a technological barrier, it shattered the Soviet Union's sense of security. In the halls of the Kremlin, the realization that the Americans possessed a submarine capable of crossing the polar ice cap without surfacing was treated as a strategic emergency. The geography of the Cold War had shifted overnight. The buffer zones of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which had protected the Russian heartland for centuries, were suddenly rendered permeable. An American nuclear submarine could now park off the coast of Murmansk or Vladivostok, hidden by the physics of the deep, and deliver a decapitating strike before a single Soviet radar station picked up a blip. The Soviet response was driven by a frantic, existential terror. The order came down from the highest levels of the Communist Party: catch up and do it at any cost. The Soviet naval engineers were brilliant, resourceful, and under immense pressure. They were tasked with shrinking the gap that the Americans had spent a decade building. But in engineering, time is a currency that cannot be forged. If you do not have time to test, you must accept risk. If you do not have time to perfect a safety system, you must rely on luck. This urgency birthed a design philosophy that would define the Soviet Navy for the next 40 years: speed over safety. The first generation of Soviet nuclear submarines, known to NATO as the November class, were marvels of brute force. They were fast, faster than the American boats of the time, and they could dive deep. But they were built with a reckless disregard for the health of the crew or the stability of the reactor. The radiation shielding was lighter to save weight. The reactor control systems were rudimentary. The internal piping was prone to cracking under the stress of thermal expansion. To the young men recruited to crew these vessels, the submarine was not just a warship, it was a radioactive wild animal. They nicknamed the K-19, a contemporary ballistic missile boat, Hiroshima. It was a grim joke that reflected a terrifying reality. In the early years of the Soviet nuclear program, radiation leaks were not considered mission-ending failures. They were considered occupational hazards. The acceptable levels of radiation exposure for a Soviet sailor were significantly higher than those for his American counterpart. The state viewed the health of the individual as a resource to be spent in defense of the collective. This culture of acceptable loss normalized disaster. When a steam pipe burst or a reactor scrammed, it was treated as a heroic struggle, a test of Soviet mettle. But physics does not care about heroism. The tragedy of the K-8 in April 1970 served as the first major warning sign that the doctrine was flawed. The K-8 was a November-class submarine participating in the massive Okean 70 naval exercise, the largest global maneuver in Soviet history. While operating in the Bay of Biscay, a fire broke out in the air regeneration system, a chemical fire fueled by the very equipment meant to keep the crew alive. The fire spread through the cable runs, crippling the ship. The reactor scrammed, leaving the boat without power. For days, the crew fought a losing battle against the sea, drifting in rough weather. 52 men died, most from carbon monoxide poisoning or hypothermia after the ship sank. It was the first loss of a Soviet nuclear submarine. In the United States Navy, the loss of a submarine like the USS Thresher triggered a massive fleet-wide safety overhaul known as SubSafe. Every bolt was checked, every procedure rewritten. In the Soviet Navy, the loss of the K-8 was classified. The families were told their sons died fulfilling their internationalist duty. The design flaws in the wiring and fire suppression systems were noted but not radically overhauled. The mission continued. The factories kept churning out hulls. The pace did not slow. However, it would be a mistake to view the Soviet submarine force merely as a collection of floating disasters. Despite the safety issues, the Soviet engineers were achieving miracles of hydrodynamics and propulsion. By the 1980s, the Red Fleet had evolved from a jagged, noisy collection of prototypes into a terrifyingly capable armada. The culmination of this effort was the Project 671 RTM, known to the West as the Victor III. The Victor III was a masterpiece of the speed over safety doctrine refined into a weapon of war. It was quiet. much quieter than its predecessors. It carried a massive teardrop-shaped pod on its rudder, a towed sonar array that allowed it to hear the enemy before the enemy heard it. It was fast, armed with wake-homing torpedoes that could break the back of an aircraft carrier. But the true power of the Victor III lay in its numbers and its audacity. The Soviet Navy realized that they might not be able to win a one-on-one duel with the ultra-sophisticated American Los Angeles-class submarines, but they could overwhelm them with aggression. In 1987, this philosophy was put to the ultimate test in an operation that remains one of the greatest untold stories of the Cold War, Operation Atrina. By the late 80s, the American Navy had grown confident, perhaps arrogant. They believed they had the Atlantic wired. The Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, a network of hydrophones on the ocean floor, tracked Soviet submarines the moment they left their bases in the Kola Peninsula. American attack submarines trailed the Soviets like shadows. The U.S. admirals believed the ocean was transparent. The Soviets decided to turn the lights off. In March 1987, 5 Victor III submarines slipped their moorings at the Zapadnaya Litsa base. They moved into the Barents Sea, a standard deployment area. The NATO sensors tracked them. It looked like a routine defensive patrol. Then, on a coordinated signal, the 5 submarines did something unexpected. They turned west. They did not move individually, they moved as a pack, utilizing a storm front to mask their acoustic signatures. They dove deep beneath the thermal layers that scatter sonar waves, and they accelerated. They disappeared. For the first time in decades, the screens at the NATO anti-submarine warfare centers went blank. 5 nuclear-powered attack submarines, each carrying dozens of torpedoes and cruise missiles, had vanished into the Atlantic. Panic rippled through the Pentagon. A missing submarine is a tactical problem. 5 missing submarines is a strategic crisis. If these boats could reach the American coast undetected, they could launch cruise missiles against Washington, D.C., Norfolk, or New York with flight times of less than 15 minutes. The entire early warning system of the United States was designed to look over the North Pole for ICBMs, not to look at the coastline for sea-skimming missiles. The U.S. Navy launched a massive manhunt. They deployed aircraft carrier battle groups, squadrons of P-3 Orion patrol planes, and their own attack submarines. They scoured the ocean with active sonar. They dropped thousands of sonobuoys. For days, they found nothing. The Soviet submarines, utilizing the Atrina tactic, had successfully breached the Guyuk Gap, the choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. They were operating in the open Atlantic, the American backyard. The psychological impact on the NATO commanders was profound. The Soviet captains were displaying a level of seamanship and discipline that Western intelligence did not believe they possessed. They were coordinating their movements underwater using acoustic codes. They were running silent, managing their reactor noise, and exploiting the hydrology of the ocean to hide. Eventually, the submarines were located. They had pushed incredibly far south, reaching the waters off Bermuda, dangerously close to the American coast. They had successfully simulated a strike posture against the U.S. naval bases on the eastern seaboard. When they finally surfaced to return home, the message had been delivered. The Soviet Navy was no longer a second-rate force of rusting hulks. They had the capability to surge into the Atlantic, evade detection, and hold American cities and ships at risk. Operation Atrina was a triumph of Soviet naval power. It was the peak of the Red Fleet's operational history. But this triumph concealed a rot that was eating the fleet from the inside out. The Victor III submarines were capable machines, but the infrastructure supporting them was crumbling. The immense cost of building and maintaining such a massive fleet was bankrupting the Soviet state. To keep these ships at sea, the Soviet Navy was cannibalizing itself. Maintenance cycles were skipped, crews were overworked. The Gold Watch crews, the best-trained officers, were exhausted. The support ships, the piers, and the training facilities were falling into disrepair. The Kremlin continued to demand more patrols, more presence, and more Atrina-style operations to prove that the USSR was still a superpower. This pressure created a dangerous paradox. At the very moment the Soviet Navy was most capable tactically, it was most fragile technically. The admirals were pushing the machines and the men to the breaking point. They were running a Formula One race with a car that hadn't had an oil change in 3 seasons. The speed over safety doctrine had evolved into mission over maintenance. The success of Operation Atrina emboldened the leadership to take even greater risks. They believed they had achieved parity with the West. They believed their technology had finally caught up. But technology requires sustainability. A nuclear submarine is a living organism. It needs constant care. The Soviet system was great at building hardware, but terrible at maintaining it. They could weld titanium and enrich uranium, but they struggled to manufacture reliable rubber seals or replacement valves. As the 1980s drew to a close, the cracks began to show. The Komsomolets disaster in 1989, the sinking of the experimental titanium submarine, was a warning shot. It showed that even the most advanced ship could be destroyed by a simple fire if the damage control systems were flawed and the crew was overwhelmed. But the momentum of the Cold War was hard to stop. The shipyards continued to churn out steel. The Typhoon class, the largest submarines ever built, were sliding into the water. The Oscar II class, designed to kill aircraft carriers with cruise missiles, joined the fleet. These were the pinnacles of Soviet naval architecture, massive, powerful, and terrifying. One of these Oscar II giants was named the Kursk. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would dwarf the early failures of the November class. The Soviet Union had built a fleet of steel coffins, filled them with nuclear reactors and high explosives, and was now running out of the money and discipline needed to keep them safe. The peak of power achieved during Operation Atrina was an illusion. It was a high water mark left by a tide that was already receding. The Soviet Union was about to collapse, and when a superpower falls, its weapons do not vanish. They remain, drifting in the deep, waiting for the maintenance to stop and the physics of decay to take over. The Red Fleet had risen. Now it was about to fall, and the ocean, patient and unforgiving, was waiting to catch it. The end of the world's second greatest superpower did not come with a nuclear bang, but with the scratching of a pen on a document in a hunting lodge in Belarus. On December 26, 1991, the flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The hammer and sickle, the symbol under which the Red Fleet had risen to challenge the masters of the oceans, was replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. To the politicians in Moscow and Washington, this was the dawn of a new era of peace. To the sailors of the Northern Fleet, freezing in the polar night of the Kola Peninsula, it was the beginning of a slow starvation. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical earthquake, and the tsunami that followed washed away the foundation of the naval infrastructure. In the span of a few months, the economy that had sustained the massive military-industrial complex evaporated. The supply chains that connected the steel mills of Ukraine to the electronics factories of the Baltics and the shipyards of Russia were severed by new national borders. For the nuclear submarine fleet, this was not a transition. It was a catastrophe. A nuclear submarine is a high-maintenance organism. It requires a constant infusion of money, specialized parts, and highly trained labor just to sit safely at a pier. It needs electricity from the shore to keep its reactor coolant pumps running. It needs steam to keep its systems from freezing. It needs security to protect its warheads. In 1992, the money stopped. The great naval bases of the Arctic, Zapadnaya Litsa, Gremika, Vidyayevo, transformed from bastions of strategic power into industrial graveyards. The sight was surreal. Dozens of the most advanced warships ever built were tied up in rows, rusting in the salt spray. The Typhoon-class submarines, the giants that had terrified NATO only 5 years earlier, sat heavy in the water. Their acoustic tiles peeling off like dead skin, the Victors and the Deltas bobbed alongside them, cold iron against the gray sky. The logistics of the fleet collapsed. The specialized trains that carried spare parts stopped running. The food deliveries became sporadic. The men who manned the apocalypse were suddenly worrying about how to feed their children. Officers, once the elite of Soviet society, went months without pay. There were reports of sailors fishing off the missile decks of nuclear submarines to supplement their rations. There were stories of copper wiring being stripped from non-essential systems and sold for scrap to buy vodka or bread. This was the rusting empire. It was a time of humiliation and danger, where the discipline of the silent service fought a losing battle against the entropy of poverty. But the danger was not just social, it was radiological. As the operational tempo slowed to a halt, the Navy faced a new crisis: what to do with the ships it could no longer afford to sail. Decommissioning a nuclear submarine is a complex, expensive engineering process. You have to remove the spent nuclear fuel, a procedure that requires specialized handling equipment and storage facilities. You have to cut out the reactor compartment and seal it. You have to process the liquid radioactive waste. The new Russian Federation had none of the resources required to do this. The shipyards were bankrupt. The storage facilities were full. So the submarines just sat there. The reactors were shut down, but they were not defueled. They remained loaded with uranium, requiring constant monitoring. The cooling systems, deprived of maintenance, began to leak. The hulls, deprived of cathodic protection, began to corrode. The nuclear archipelago of the Arctic coast became a parking lot for ticking time bombs. At Gremika, the situation was particularly dire. This was the base for the liquid metal-cooled Alpha-class submarines. As we have seen, these reactors required constant heating to prevent the lead-bismuth coolant from freezing. When the shore steam plants failed due to lack of fuel or parts, the submarine crews were forced into heroic, desperate measures to keep their ships alive. But eventually they lost the battle. The reactors froze. The ships became radioactive monoliths, impossible to move, impossible to fix, and too dangerous to scrap without technology that Russia did not possess. The environmental threat was staggering. During the 1990s, Western environmental groups and governments began to realize the scale of the problem. Norway, sharing a border and a sea with the Northern Fleet, watched with horror. They saw a neighboring military force that was armed with thousands of nuclear warheads but could barely afford to pay its electric bill. The risk of an accidental launch, a reactor meltdown caused by neglect, or the theft of nuclear material by desperate servicemen became the primary security concern of the post-Cold War world. This desperation led to the normalization of dangerous practices. To save money, the Navy extended the service lives of batteries and chemical regeneration canisters far beyond their expiration dates. They cannibalized parts from one submarine to keep another running. They cut back on training hours. The safety culture that had been tenuous in the Soviet era disintegrated completely. Safety costs money, and there was no money. Yet amidst this decay, there remained a fierce, defiant pride. The Russian Admiralty refused to accept that they were no longer a superpower. They convinced the political leadership in the Kremlin that maintaining a blue-water navy was essential to Russia's status as a great nation. They argued that the submarine fleet was the only remaining credible deterrent against the United States. This political necessity drove a dangerous decision. Despite the lack of funds, the Navy would keep its newest, most powerful ships in service, and it would continue to build new ones. The shipyards at Severodvinsk, though starving, continued to work on the hulls that had been laid down before the collapse. They focused their limited resources on the Oscar II class, the massive cruise missile carriers designed to sink aircraft carriers. These ships were the guarantors of Russian relevance. One of these ships, K-141, was completed in 1994. She was named the Kursk after the city of the famous World War II tank battle. The Kursk was a magnificent anomaly. She was commissioned at the nadir of the Russian Navy's fortunes. While other ships were rotting at the pier, the Kursk was shiny, modern, and powerful. She was 154 meters long, displaced 19,000 tons, and carried 24 granite missiles. She was a symbol of hope. She was proof that Russia could still build giants. To the crew, serving on the Kursk was a salvation. It meant better food, regular pay, and the prestige of serving on the flagship of the flotilla. The Kursk was the unsinkable aircraft carrier killer. She was the best of the best. But the Kursk was also a product of the system that built her. She was a technological marvel wrapped in a blanket of institutional poverty. While her hull was new, the infrastructure supporting her was old. The torpedoes loaded into her tubes were legacy weapons drawn from stockpiles that had been sitting in warehouses for years. The training exercises she participated in were often scripted and limited to save fuel. By the late 1990s, the Russian economy began to stabilize slightly, and the Navy attempted to return to high-tempo operations. They wanted to show the flag. In 1999, the Kursk conducted a successful reconnaissance mission in the Mediterranean, tracking the U.S. Sixth Fleet during the Kosovo War. It was a moment of triumph. The Russian bear was back. But this resurgence was fragile. It was built on a foundation that had been hollowed out by a decade of neglect. The rusting empire was trying to act like a superpower without paying the price of admission. The admirals were demanding performance that the infrastructure could not safely support. The psychological climate of the fleet in the year 2000 was a dangerous mix of arrogance and anxiety. The officers wanted to prove they were still capable. They pushed their crews and their machines. They ignored the warning signs, the small leaks, the faulty sensors, the skipped inspections, because the mission was everything. The decision to conduct the massive Summer X exercise in August 2000 was the culmination of this effort. It was to be the largest naval maneuver since the fall of the Soviet Union. 30 ships and 3 submarines would take to the Barents Sea. It was a show of force for the world to see. But behind the pageantry, the risks were accumulating. The Kursk was sent to sea carrying a fat torpedo, a practice weapon powered by hydrogen peroxide. This fuel, HTP, was known to be volatile. It required meticulous maintenance and handling. In a navy where sailors were sometimes selling diesel fuel to buy cigarettes, the rigorous standards required for handling chemical weapons were slipping. The HTP torpedo was a relic of the speed over safety doctrine, a cheap way to get high performance. The British had abandoned it in the 1950s after the HMS Sidon disaster. The Soviets kept it. And in the chaotic, resource-starved environment of the post-Soviet Navy, that torpedo became a ticking time bomb. The stage was set for a collision between the ambition of the Russian state and the reality of its decay. The Kursk sailed out of the Zapadnaya Litsa base looking like a conqueror. She was the pride of the fleet, but she was sailing into a trap laid by history. The collapse of the Soviet Union had not just destroyed the economy, it had destroyed the margin for error. In the old days, if a system failed, there were resources to fix it. Now, there were none. If a fire broke out, the rescue ships were slow and broken. If a sailor was trapped, the diving bells were rusted. The Kursk was about to demonstrate that you cannot build a first-class navy on a third-world budget. The tragedy that followed would expose the lie of the post-Soviet recovery. It would show the world that the steel coffins of the Cold War were still waiting to claim their due. As the massive submarine submerged into the cold, clear waters of the Barents Sea on August 12, 2000, she carried with her the hopes of a nation desperate for a victory. She carried 118 men who believed in their ship. But she also carried a welding flaw in a practice torpedo, a flaw that was about to turn the pride of the North into a tomb. The empire had rusted, but the physics of an explosion remained as sharp and unforgiving as ever. On the morning of August 12, 2000, the Barents Sea was calm, a gray expanse of water under a low Arctic sky. Below the surface, the Russian Navy was conducting its most significant show of force since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Summer X exercise was designed to prove to the world, and perhaps to Russia itself, that the dark days of the 1990s were over. 30 surface ships and 3 submarines were maneuvering in a complex choreography of mock warfare. At the center of this formation was the crown jewel of the Northern Fleet, the K-141 Kursk. The Kursk was a Leviathan, an Oscar II-class cruise missile submarine. She was twice the length of a jumbo jet and displaced nearly 20,000 tons submerged. She was built to be a carrier killer, armed with 24 P-700 Granite missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to targets 300 miles away. Her double hull was separated by a wide buffer zone, leading her designers to claim she was virtually unsinkable. She was the symbol of the new Russia, powerful, modern, and resilient. But inside the forward torpedo room, a microscopic failure was about to dismantle that symbol with terrifying violence. At 11:28 a.m. local time, the Kursk was preparing to fire a dummy torpedo. The weapon loaded in tube number 4 was a Type 6576 kit, a massive practice round powered by high-test peroxide, HTP. As we have seen, HTP is a volatile oxidizer that requires pristine conditions to remain stable. Inside the tube, a faulty weld or a degraded seal allowed the peroxide to leak. It touched a catalyst, perhaps rust or the kerosene fuel, and expanded instantly. The first explosion was not nuclear, nor was it the detonation of a warhead. It was a pneumatic rupture. The pressure inside the tube spiked, blowing the back hatch open into the torpedo room. A jet of superheated steam and fire engulfed the compartment, instantly killing the 7 sailors stationed there. This initial blast registered as a seismic event with a magnitude of 1.5 on sensors in Norway. To the fleet on the surface, it sounded like a dull thud. The cruiser Peter the Great, the flagship of the exercise, felt the shudder. But in the confusion of a live fire drill, the command staff hesitated. They assumed it was part of the exercise, perhaps the impact of a practice weapon. No distress signal was sent. The explosion had destroyed the communications gear in the bow. The Kursk began to dip by the nose, plowing into the seabed at a depth of 108 meters, 354 feet. If the disaster had ended there, the rest of the crew might have survived. The reactor compartment was shielded, the aft sections were intact. But the fire in the bow was being fed by the oxygen-rich peroxide. It burned with the intensity of a blowtorch. The temperature climbed rapidly, cooking the other weapons stored on the racks. 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the first explosion, the heat reached the critical threshold. 5 to 7 combat-ready torpedo warheads detonated simultaneously. The second explosion was a geological event. It registered 4.2 on the Richter scale, equivalent to 2 to 3 tons of TNT. The force was devastating. It tore a massive hole in the starboard bow, peeling back the thick steel of the pressure hull like foil. The shockwave hammered backward through the ship. It obliterated the second and third compartments, killing the command crew in the control room instantly. It twisted bulkheads, shattered pipes, and sent a wall of fire and debris rushing toward the reactor. The Kursk settled on the bottom, a broken ruin. The silence that followed was absolute. But the Kursk was not dead. In the aft compartments, number 6, 7, 8, and 9, the double hull and the heavy reactor shielding absorbed the worst of the shockwave. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim, eerie glow of emergency lighting. The dust settled, and amidst the wreckage, men began to move. 23 sailors had survived the inferno. They were the turbine technicians, the electricians, and the reactor engineers. Stunned, bleeding, and terrified, they retreated to the 9th compartment, the escape tunnel at the very stern of the boat. Command fell to Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, a 27-year-old turbine officer. In the darkness of the 9th compartment, amidst the rising water and the cooling air, Kolesnikov took charge. He organized the survivors. He checked the pressure. He realized they were trapped. The escape hatch in the 9th compartment was their only way out. But the pressure of the ocean at 100 meters is immense. To open the hatch, they would need to equalize the pressure or wait for a rescue vehicle to mate with the docking ring. Kolesnikov did something else. In the flickering light, he pulled out a notebook and began to write. His letters, recovered months later, provide the only first-hand account of the tragedy. They transformed the Kursk from a story of engineering failure into a story of human endurance. 13:15. All personnel from compartment 6, 7, and 8 moved to the 9th. There are 23 of us here. We have made this decision as a result of the accident. None of us can get to the surface. Later, as the air grew foul and the cold set in, he wrote again. It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances, 10-20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Greetings to everyone. No need to despair. While Kolesnikov and his men waited in the dark, a different kind of darkness was descending on the Russian naval command. The fog of war had been replaced by the fog of denial. For hours, the fleet command did not realize the Kursk was missing. It wasn't until late evening, when the submarine failed to check in, that the alarm was raised. The rescue ships were deployed, but their equipment was a reflection of the rusting empire that had built them. The rescue submersibles Prise and Bester were old, poorly maintained, and crewed by men who had not practiced deep-water mating drills in years. On land, the political reaction was paralyzed. President Vladimir Putin was on vacation at the Black Sea. The naval admirals, terrified of admitting the scale of the disaster, fed the media a stream of lies and obfuscations. They claimed the Kursk had minor technical difficulties. They claimed they were in radio contact with the crew. They claimed they were pumping air into the ship. None of this was true. As the days passed, the world watched in horror. The British and Norwegian governments, realizing the gravity of the situation, offered their advanced deep-sea rescue technology. They had divers and submersibles capable of opening the hatch. But the Russian admirals refused. They were driven by a Cold War paranoia that viewed foreign assistance as espionage. They feared that NATO divers would see the secrets of the Kursk, the missile systems, the codes, the reactor design. They prioritized the secrecy of the weapon over the lives of the crew. While the politicians debated and the admirals stalled, The clock ran out in the ninth compartment. The survivors had oxygen regeneration cartridges, chemical plates that scrub carbon dioxide and release oxygen. But these chemicals are volatile. If they come into contact with oil or water, they can ignite. Forensic analysis suggests that sometime in the days following the explosion, a regeneration cartridge fell into the oily water pooling on the floor of the compartment. It triggered a flash fire. The fire consumed the remaining oxygen in seconds. The 23 men who had survived the explosion and the cold died of asphyxiation and carbon monoxide poisoning. It was not until August 16th, 4 days after the sinking, that Russia finally accepted foreign help. By the time the Norwegian divers arrived on the Seaway Eagle, the window for survival had closed. The Norwegians were professionals. It took them mere hours to do what the Russian Navy had failed to do for a week. They dived to the wreck, they cleared the debris from the escape hatch, they equalized the pressure, and they opened the airlock. A stream of bubbles escaped, followed by a cloud of stale dead water. The compartment was flooded. There were no survivors. The opening of the hatch released the truth that the Russian government had tried to suppress. The Kursk was full of water. The crew had been dead long before the rescue ships arrived. The lies about radio contact and tapping on the hull were exposed as a cruel charade designed to manage public opinion. The political fallout was seismic. The Kursk disaster became a symbol of the rot at the heart of the post-Soviet state. It exposed the hollowness of the military revival. The unsinkable ship had been sunk by a rusty torpedo. The world-class rescue fleet was a junkyard, and the leadership had chosen to protect its reputation rather than its sailors. The image of Nadezhda Tylek, the mother of a Kursk sailor, screaming at the admirals in a press conference before being forcibly sedated by a nurse, was beamed around the world. It became the defining image of the tragedy, the state silencing the grief of the people to hide its own incompetence. But the story of the Kursk did not end with the recovery of the bodies. The wreck itself remained a massive environmental hazard. The reactor compartment was intact, but the bow was a tangled ruin of unexploded ordnance. The Russian government, shamed by the disaster, committed to raising the ship. This operation, conducted the following year, was a technological triumph that contrasted sharply with the rescue failure. A consortium of Dutch companies, Moet and Smit International, used a massive barge and hydraulic jacks to lift the Kursk from the seabed. It was the first time a nuclear submarine of that size had been recovered. The raising of the Kursk allowed for a proper investigation. It confirmed the HTP torpedo theory, debunking the Russian admiral's claims of a collision with an American submarine. It allowed the families to bury their dead, and it allowed Dmitry Kolesnikov's letter to be found in his pocket, a voice from the grave that indicted the system that had failed him. The Kursk disaster forced a reckoning. The hydrogen peroxide torpedoes were finally withdrawn from service, 50 years after the West had deemed them too dangerous. The Navy's rescue capabilities were slowly modernized, but the scars remained. The Kursk demonstrated that the speed over safety doctrine had consequences that outlived the Cold War. The submarine was designed to fight a global war, but it couldn't survive a peacetime exercise. It was a machine built by a system that valued the hardware more than the meat inside it. The 23 men in the ninth compartment died waiting. They waited for a rescue that was technologically possible but politically impossible. They waited while their leaders lied. They waited in the cold and the dark, holding on to hope until the air ran out. Their deaths marked the end of the era of denial. The Russian public would no longer blindly accept the military's version of events. The Kursk broke the seal of silence that had surrounded the Soviet submarine fleet for decades. But as we will see, old habits die hard. The lessons of the Kursk, transparency, safety, the value of human life, were learned, but they were not always remembered. The pressure to project power, to maintain the image of a superpower, remained. As the Kursk was cut up for scrap, the Russian Navy began to build a new generation of submarines. They were quieter, more advanced, and more automated. One of these new ships was the Nerpa, and 8 years after the Kursk, in the same ocean that claimed the K-27, the Nerpa would demonstrate that the system could still kill its crew, even without an explosion. The cycle of tragedy had not been broken, it had merely changed form. The danger was no longer just a rusty torpedo, it was the computer code of a fire suppression system, and the enduring belief that a submarine is more important than the men who sail it. when the toxic fog cleared from the second compartment of the K-152 Nerpa. In November 2008, leaving 20 men dead on the floor plates, the initial reaction from the Russian Naval Command was remarkably consistent with the past. They did not blame the design, they did not blame the sensors, they blamed a sailor. The official investigation quickly zeroed in on Seaman Dmitry Grobov, a 24-year-old machinist. The prosecutors alleged that Grobov, ostensibly bored or playing with the controls, had adjusted a temperature sensor setting that triggered the fire suppression system. It was a convenient narrative, a rogue individual, a moment of carelessness, a tragic accident caused by human error. It protected the reputation of the shipbuilders and the admirals. But the truth of the Nerpa disaster was far more disturbing than a simple button pressed by mistake. It was a systemic failure of the philosophy that had guided Soviet and Russian naval engineering for 40 years. The belief that automation is superior to the human crew. To understand why the Nerpa killed its own passengers, we must look at the specific technology involved. The submarine was an Akula II class attack boat, one of the most advanced vessels in the Russian inventory. It was quiet, fast, and lethal. It was also designed to be sold. The Nerpa was destined to be leased to the Indian Navy, where it would later serve as the INS Chakra. Because of this commercial imperative, the sea trials were rushed. There was immense pressure to certify the ship and collect the payment. The system at the heart of the tragedy was the LOK, Lodka Objemnaya Chimicheskaya fire suppression system. In the closed environment of a submarine, fire is the ultimate enemy. A fire consumes the oxygen the crew needs to breathe and produces toxic smoke that can incapacitate the command center in minutes. To combat this, Russian submarines use a total flooding strategy. The LOK system uses Freon 114B2, a heavy, chemically inert gas. When released into a compartment, it does not just spray the fire, it replaces the atmosphere. The gas is heavier than air. It cascades down from nozzles in the overhead, settling like an invisible liquid, pushing the oxygen up and away from the flames. It is brutally effective. It will extinguish a raging oil fire in seconds. But it is also an asphyxiant. If a human being is standing in a room flooded with Freon, their lungs fill with the gas. The gas cannot be metabolized. The body is starved of oxygen. Unconsciousness strikes without the warning of choking or pain. The lights simply go out. The designers of the Nerpa knew this. The safety protocols required that every person on board carry a portable breathing apparatus, PDA, a small belt-mounted kit containing a mask and a chemical oxygen generator. In the event of a fire alarm, the drill is absolute. Hold your breath, don the mask, and wait for the gas to do its work. This protocol works for a trained military crew. It relies on muscle memory and discipline drilled into sailors since boot camp. But on the night of November 8th, the Nerpa was not carrying a standard crew. It was carrying a trial team. Of the 208 people on board, 81 were military personnel. The rest, 127 men, were civilians. They were welders, electricians, and engineers from the Amur shipbuilding plant. They were there to fix leaks, calibrate sensors, and finish the construction work while the submarine was at sea. These civilians were experts in their trades, but they were not submariners. They had received only cursory safety briefings. Many did not have their breathing kits on their belts. They had left them in their bunks or in lockers because they were bulky and uncomfortable to work in. Some reports suggest there weren't even enough functional kits for everyone on board. When the system triggered, the alarm did not provide a grace period. In Western designs, there is often a delay, a siren that screams gas release imminent, giving the crew time to mask up. On the Nerpa, the release was instantaneous. The Molniya automated control system detected a threat and executed the solution immediately. It prioritized the safety of the ship over the safety of the lung. The scene in the second compartment was a massacre by chemistry. The Freon dumped into the sleeping quarters. The civilians, waking up to the hissing sound, were confused. They did not have the instinctive reaction to reach for a mask. They stood up, tried to speak, and inhaled the gas. The automation then executed the next step in its logic, containment. The watertight doors slammed shut automatically. The men were sealed in. Those who did manage to find their breathing kits faced a second, horrifying failure. Many of the kits were old. They had been in storage for years. When the men pulled the activation tabs, the chemical generators failed to fire or the masks were brittle and cracked. They were holding useless plastic while they suffocated. The human error narrative concocted by the prosecutors fell apart in the subsequent trials. Seaman Grobov and Captain Dmitry Lavrentiev were acquitted by a jury, not once, but twice. The defense team, aided by courageous naval experts, exposed the rot inside the Nerpa. They proved that the Locate system had triggered spontaneously. It wasn't a button press, it was a ghost signal. The sensors in the compartment were cheap, prone to corrosion and electrical interference. The central computer, confusing a data glitch for a thermal spike, decided there was a fire when there was none. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that the freon in the tanks was not pure. To save money, the shipyard or the suppliers had reportedly mixed the fire suppressant with a toxic solvent, tetrachloroethylene. This meant the gas didn't just asphyxiate the men, it poisoned them. It was a lethal cocktail loaded into a safety system. The Nerpa disaster was the automation trap closing on its victims. The Soviet, and later Russian, obsession with reducing crew size and increasing reaction speed had created a ship where the computer was the captain. The machine had the authority to release lethal gas without human confirmation. It treated the crew as a liability to be managed rather than the asset to be protected. This philosophy stands in stark contrast to Western naval doctrine. In the U.S. Navy, flooding a compartment with halon, the Western equivalent, requires a specific manual action by the crew. A human being must look at the sensors, confirm the fire, and turn a key. There is a man in the loop. The system trusts the sailor. The Russian system trusted the sensor. The acquittal of the captain and the sailor was a rare moment of justice, but it did not fix the fleet. The Nerpa was eventually repaired, the gas tanks refilled, and the submarine leased to India. The dead were buried, but the design flaw remained. The logic that built the Nerpa, speed, automation, and a cavalier attitude toward human safety, was baked into the keel. As the Nerpa resumed its patrols, another, even more secretive tragedy was brewing in the deep. If the Nerpa represented the dangers of the new, export-oriented Russia, the next disaster would highlight the enduring, paranoid secrecy of the old Cold War state. Deep beneath the Barents Sea, a vessel that officially did not exist was conducting a mission that officially never happened. This was the Losharik. The AS-12 Losharik is not a standard submarine. It is a deep-diving nuclear station, a spy ship operated by the Main Directorate of Deep Sea Research, GUJI. This directorate reports directly to the Ministry of Defense, bypassing the normal naval command. The Losharik is a ghost. It is designed to dive to depths of 500 meters or more, far deeper than any attack submarine. Its mission is seabed warfare, tapping cables, retrieving wreckage, and mapping the ocean floor for the day the world ends. To withstand the crushing pressure of the abyss, the Losharik is not built as a cylinder. Its interior consists of 7 interconnected titanium spheres. This string of pearls construction gives it immense strength, but it creates a claustrophobic, compartmentalized interior. On July 1, 2019, the Losharik was operating in Russian territorial waters. On board were the elite of the elite. Of the crew present, 7 were captains of the first rank, the naval equivalent of a colonel. 2 were heroes of the Russian Federation. This was not a training cruise, it was a gathering of the highest value human assets in the Russian Navy. A fire broke out in the battery compartment. The details of what happened next are shrouded in the highest levels of classification. Unlike the Kursk or the Nerpa, there were no leaks to the press, no public trials, and no international assistance. The story of the Losharik is told only in the obituaries of the men who died. We know that the fire was violent, we know that the crew fought it, and we know that they made a choice. According to the few details released by the Kremlin, a civilian specialist was on board. The officers, realizing the fire was out of control, forced the civilian into the escape capsule and sealed the hatch. They saved his life. Then the officers returned to the fire. They sealed themselves into the burning compartment to prevent the flames from reaching the nuclear reactor. The Losharik, like the Nerpa and the Komsomolets, was a victim of the internal threat. But the response of the crew was a callback to the heroism of Sergei Preminin on the K-278. They knew that if the fire breached the battery compartment and reached the nuclear station, the vessel would be lost, and the reactor could be compromised. 14 senior officers died in the fire. They died of smoke inhalation and burns inside the titanium spheres. They managed to surface the submarine, but they did not survive the ascent. The Losharik incident demonstrated that even the most elite, well-trained crews are vulnerable to the inherent dangers of the technology. These were men with decades of experience, the best submariners Russia had. And yet, a battery fire killed them just as surely as it had killed the crew of the K-8 50 years earlier. The secrecy surrounding the Losharik highlights the dual nature of the Russian submarine force. On one hand, it is a tool of state power, projected globally. On the other, it is a closed society where mistakes are buried. The families of the Losharik crew were given medals and pensions, but they were told almost nothing about how their husbands died. The funeral was closed, the press was barred. The Nerpa and the Losharik represent the two poles of the modern Russian tragedy. The Nerpa was a tragedy of carelessness, of cheap censors and untrained civilians. The Losharik was a tragedy of duty, of elite officers sacrificing themselves to save a secret ship. Both disasters were fueled by the same underlying reality. The ocean is unforgiving, and nuclear submarines are fragile machines. The automation trap of the Nerpa showed that removing the human element leads to accidental death. The Losharik showed that even with the best humans on board, the fire often wins. As we reach the present day, the Russian Navy is rebuilding. New classes of submarines, the Yasen and the Borei, are entering service. They are quieter, better built, and safer than their Soviet predecessors. The lessons of the Kursk and the Nerpa have to some extent been learned, but the legacy fleet remains. The ocean floor is still littered with the wrecks of the past. And the philosophy of mission first is still the guiding light of the Admiralty. The automation that killed the men on the Nerpa is still there, perhaps updated, but driven by the same logic. The secrecy that shrouded the Losharik is still the default setting of the state. The steel coffins are still patrolling. They are moving through the Barents Sea and the Atlantic right now, carrying crews who trust their lives to valves made by the lowest bidder and code written by engineers who never went to sea. The cycle continues, the technology advances, but the risk remains constant. The ocean waits for the next spark, the next glitch, the next seal to fail. And when it does, the result will not be a debate about engineering. It will be a telegram sent to a family in a naval garrison town, informing them that their son has gone on eternal patrol. Deep beneath the surface of the Barents Sea, where the pressure is strong enough to crush a conventional submarine like an aluminum can, a ghost ship prowls the continental shelf. It does not carry the flag of the Russian Navy in the traditional sense. It answers to a separate, shadowy organization known as GUJI, the main directorate of deep-sea research. This vessel, the AS-12 Losharik, is the physical embodiment of the modern Russian state's obsession with the seabed. It is a machine built for a new kind of Cold War, one fought not with missiles, but with wiretaps, sensor arrays, and the manipulation of the internet cables that knit the world together. On July 1, 2019, the secret war turned hot. The Losharik is a technological marvel that rivals the Typhoon in ambition, though not in size. To withstand depths of up to 2,500 meters, 8,200 feet, its pressure hull is not a cylinder, but a chain of 7 interconnected titanium spheres. This string of pearls design distributes the crushing weight of the ocean more evenly than a tube, allowing the Losharik to operate in the abyssal zones where no attack submarine can follow. It is a spaceship for the bottom of the world, docked beneath the belly of a massive mothership, the converted ballistic missile submarine Podmoskovye. The crew of the Losharik are not ordinary sailors. They are hydronauts. They are the elite of the elite, officers chosen for their technical brilliance and their absolute loyalty. On that day in July, the manifest read like a who's who of the Russian submarine service. 7 captains of the first rank, the equivalent of a full colonel or a commodore in Western navies, were on board. 2 were holders of the Hero of the Russian Federation, the highest honor the state can bestow. This was not a routine patrol. It was a gathering of masters conducting a mission of extreme sensitivity. While the exact nature of their mission remains a state secret, the disaster that befell them followed a grimly familiar script. A fire broke out in the battery compartment. In the confined spherical rooms of the Losharik, a fire is a tactical nightmare. The titanium walls reflect the heat. The oxygen, vital for life, becomes the fuel for the flames. The smoke fills the spheres instantly. The reaction of the crew was a testament to the harsh lessons learned from the Kursk and the Komsomolets. They did not wait for orders. They did not rely on automation. They acted with a cold, sacrificial logic. According to the fragmented accounts released by the Ministry of Defense, a civilian specialist was on board the vessel. As the fire raged, the high-ranking officers physically forced the civilian into the forward escape module, likely the transfer tunnel connecting them to the mothership, and sealed the hatch. They saved the guest. Then they turned back to the fire. The officers understood the stakes. The Losharik is nuclear-powered. If the fire breached the reactor compartment sphere, or if the vessel was lost with the reactor active, it would be a strategic catastrophe. Furthermore, the loss of the Losharik itself, one of Russia's most valuable intelligence assets, would be a devastating blow. They sealed themselves into the burning compartments to fight the flames. They chose to become the containment system. 14 men died. They died of smoke inhalation and thermal injuries, fighting a battery fire in a titanium sphere at the bottom of the sea. They succeeded in saving the ship. The Losharik was brought to the surface and towed back to Severomorsk. The reactor remained secure. The civilian survived. But the aftermath of the Losharik fire revealed a profound shift in the relationship between the Russian state and its tragedies. In 2000, after the Kursk, the family screamed at the cameras, and the world demanded answers. In 2019, there was silence. The funeral for the 14 hydronauts was held at the Serafimovskoye Cemetery in St. Petersburg. It was a closed affair. The press was barred. The graves were guarded by military police. The identities of the men were released only reluctantly, and the details of their deaths were scrubbed from the record. This was silence by design. The Russian government had learned that information is dangerous. They managed the Losharik disaster by suffocating the narrative. There were no press conferences with weeping admirals. There were no appeals for foreign help. There was only a brief statement from President Putin acknowledging a great loss followed by the closing of the file. The Losharik incident demonstrated that the culture of secrecy, which had doomed the K-431 in Chashma Bay 30 years earlier, was alive and well. The state had become more efficient at hiding its scars. The heroism of the crew was celebrated, but the cause of the fire, the likely failure of a lithium-ion battery or a short circuit in the aging electrical system, was treated as a state secret. As we look at the Russian Navy today, we see a fleet trapped between two eras. On one hand, there is a resurgence of power. The new Bore-class ballistic missile submarines are silent and deadly, patrolling the Arctic bastions with a stealth that rivals the best American boats. The Yasin-class attack submarines are masterpieces of engineering, capable of striking land targets with hypersonic missiles. But beneath this veneer of modernization lies the eternal patrol of the legacy fleet. The ocean is still crowded with the steel coffins of the Cold War. The Delta IV submarines, built in the 1980s, are still sailing. The Victor thrillers are gone, but their descendants, the Akulas and Sierras, are pushing 40 years of service. These ships are tired. Their hulls have been subjected to decades of pressure cycles. Their wiring is brittle. Their reactors are operating far beyond their original design lives. The infrastructure supporting them is still recovering from the collapse of the 1990s. The dry docks are full, the backlog of maintenance is immense, and the temptation to cut corners, to extend a service life by 5 years, to skip a deep overhaul, to rely on a reduced availability maintenance period is as strong as it was in the days of the Scorpion or the K-219. The most dangerous thing about these submarines is not their age, but the fact that the world has forgotten to be afraid of them. During the Cold War, the fear of nuclear annihilation was a daily reality. Today, we assume the nuclear deterrent is a static, safe background program. We trust that the missiles will stay in their tubes and the reactors will stay cool. We trust the systems to work. But the history of the Russian submarine force teaches us that trust is a dangerous commodity. The systems fail. The torpedoes leak. The batteries explode. The automation suffocates the crew. The ocean floor is a graveyard that proves the fallibility of these machines. The K-8, K-27, K-219, Komsomolets, Kursk, and Scorpion, they are all down there, monuments to the limits of engineering and the cost of ambition. The Russian Navy is currently building the Belgorod, the longest submarine in the world. It is designed to carry the Poseidon, a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed drone torpedo the size of a school bus, designed to cross the ocean autonomously and detonate a radioactive tsunami against a coastal city. It is a weapon of madness, a throwback to the darkest paranoia of the Cold War. It represents a doubling down on the philosophy of the doomsday machine. It is a system designed to operate without human intervention, to travel deeper and faster than anything else. It is the spiritual successor to the Alpha and the Komsomolets. It is a technological marvel that pushes the boundaries of physics, and it carries the same inherent risks. What happens if the nuclear reactor on a Poseidon drone fails in the middle of the Pacific? What happens if the automation glitches? We are building new monsters before we have finished burying the old ones. As the polar ice cap recedes, opening the Arctic to commercial shipping and oil exploration, the nuclear archipelago is becoming a busy intersection. The isolation that protected the wrecks of the K-27 and the Komsomolets is disappearing. The environment is changing, and the corrosion clock is ticking faster. The story of Russia's nuclear submarine tragedy is not a history lesson, it is a current event. The patrols continue. The reactors hum. The young men in the vivid blue uniforms of the Russian Navy still kiss their wives goodbye on the piers of Severomorsk and Gadjevo, stepping into steel tubes that will take them into the most hostile environment on Earth. They are brave men. They are serving their country, but they are also hostages to a philosophy that has always viewed them as expendable components in a great machine. As the credits roll on this documentary, we are left with a final, unsettling image. It is not of an explosion or a sinking, it is the image of a submarine on the surface, moving slowly through the gray mist of the Barents Sea. It looks powerful, it looks invincible, but we know better now. We know what is happening inside the hull. We know about the frayed wires, the aging seals, and the silence of the men standing watch in the reactor room. We know that the margin between a routine patrol and a global tragedy is often no wider than a rubber gasket or a line of computer code. The ocean is vast, and it is patient. It has swallowed the mistakes of the past, and it is waiting for the mistakes of the future. The steel coffins are still patrolling, and the world is watching, hoping that this time the physics will hold. But hope is not an engineering strategy, and the ocean does not forgive. The tragedy of the Russian nuclear submarine fleet is a story of human ambition colliding with the hard limits of reality. It is a story of a nation that reached for the stars, or rather, the abyss, while standing on a foundation that was crumbling beneath its feet. From the nitrogen dioxide fumes of K-219 to the icy waters of the Komsomolets, and from the suffocating darkness of the Nerpa to the secret fire of the Losharik, the pattern is clear. The quest for speed over safety, for mission over men, extracts a terrible toll. These disasters were not acts of God. They were the logical results of decisions made in design bureaus and political offices. They were the cost of doing business in the Cold War, but the cost was paid by individuals. It was paid by Sergei Preminin turning a crank in a burning room. It was paid by Dmitry Kolesnikov writing a letter in the dark. It was paid by the civilians on the Nerpa holding useless gas masks. As we look at the legacy of these ships, we must remember that behind the titanium hulls and the nuclear reactors, there is always a human heartbeat. And as long as we continue to build weapons that are too dangerous to fail, we will continue to ask men to die trying to save them. The ocean floor is quiet now. The wrecks are sleeping. But they are not gone. They are the steel witnesses to a century of fear, waiting in the dark for us to remember the lessons they died to teach us. If this deep dive into the hidden history of the Cold War and the tragedy of the Russian submarine fleet meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.